Students are at the centre of everything we do, and everything we are trying to improve is for their benefit and experience. QQI is excited for all providers and stakeholders to focus on this next session, centring students in quality assurance to promote equity and engagement. Our keynote speaker for this session is Professor Peter Felten of Elon University in North Carolina in the United States. Welcome, Peter.
Good afternoon. I'm from the American South now, so there's this thing we do where when I say something, you're supposed to respond. So good afternoon. Although I have to say, where I come from, what I should say right now is good morning. But thank you so much for having me here. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be part of the conversation so far. I hope this session is really stimulating and exciting, and I apologize for my accent. I hope you can understand some of my language. One last thing before I begin, which is I have the privilege this year to be in something, it's got a long title. So I'm in the Fulbright Canada Distinguished Chair in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at Carleton University in Ottawa in Canada. So thank you for rescuing me from Canadian winter for a few days. And again, I want to thank the Fulbright and folks for making that possible. So we're here to talk about centering students in quality assurance to promote equity and engagement. And the last session that just happened on the stage so rhymed with what we're going to be talking about now. I just want to lift up three things that people on this stage or at that table said in the last session that seem completely aligned with what we're talking about today. Minister Harris said the learner is at the heart of everything we do. Of course. The question really, I think, isn't should the learner be at the heart of everything we do? I think a better question is how do we think about the learner? Do we think about them as customers, as objects of the heart of everything we do? Or Dr. Reddy from South Africa, I think, framed it correctly. We need to think about students as active agents, as partners in everything we do. And to do that, as Professor Ellis said, we really need to honor student voice. We need to bring student voices very deeply and centrally into all our work, especially around quality assurance and equity, to get towards the engagement goals, to get towards the civic goals, to get towards the income goals our students might have. Right? So I'm just going to have a few remarks, maybe 10 minutes or so, to orient you from my own perspective, because I'm coming from a different vantage point in the US and drawing on research and experience in the US. I also happen to be on the board of the National Survey of Student Engagement in the US, which is associated, NESE, it's associated with the Student Engagement Survey here. And so what I want to offer from my perspective, and invite you to think about from your perspective, is 5 principles on centering students. Before I do this, I just want to underscore that I know there's very impressive work happening in Ireland already. If you have not seen it for some reason, really, I urge you to look at the NSTEP 2022-2025 strategy, which I think is exceptional. I think it's world-class work there. And so what I'm going to do is not repeat that, but take a different perspective on the same thing, asking the question, how do we do this work? How do we actually center students in quality assurance and engagement in ways that are equitable? And my suggestion is these 5 principles should be at the heart of what we're thinking about in our work, the heart of the design for our work, so we can do this work systematically. So briefly, let me just touch on what I'm thinking about with these 5 principles. The first is about evidence-informed. And you heard hints of this throughout the day. I think the evidence we draw on needs to be both local and national, right? We should use things like the student survey in Ireland. We should use also stories, though. As we were talking earlier, students, especially students from equity-seeking groups, can disappear in a lot of our assessment data, in a lot of our survey data, for example. So if you wanted to think about the experience of disabled students during COVID, or students with disabilities during COVID at your institution, you could look at survey data from your institution. But how would you know if this percentage of students who are concerned about a particular issue are students with disabilities or not, right? So first, what we need to do is use quantitative data and qualitative data to find out what's really happening inside there. Secondly, I think something that we involved in quality assurance in the US at least just chronically have a problem with is we look very closely at data that our institution generated. And we almost completely ignore all the research on these same topics. And so we should think about what is the research telling us more broadly that should inform how we think about quality here in this context. And then third, and I think most importantly when we're thinking about evidence-informed, the evidence needs to be in the hands of the people who use it. Too often in the US, we get surveys like NESI, for example, and it goes to the president and the academic deans. And the people who could actually act on this, the people who are interacting with students, never see the data or never access the data in ways that's useful. So for our practice to be evidence-informed, it really has to be in the hands of students. Excuse me, in the hands of the people who can use it. A second point is that our work needs to be equity-minded, and we heard this quite a lot in the conversation about academic integrity in a different way, which is if we have systematic inequities, we need to approach those with systematic remedies. One of the biggest challenges in the US right now in higher education is around inequities in experiences and in outcomes, inequities in engagement. And too often in the US, what we do is we rely on individual staff and individual programs to address those. And it's really important, of course, that individual staff and individual programs address these problems. But if we have systemic inequities at my institution, the solution to that cannot be lots of individuals acting on their own. We need systemic work to remedy that. Second point here is that really engaging with equity requires a level of humility at both the institutional level and the individual level. At the individual level, I think many of us have learned to recognize my perspective is not everyone's perspective. I really need to understand and try to appreciate perspectives that are different than mine. But in the US, one of the challenges we have with this is institutional humility. Too often in the US, we say, well, how do we do something? How do we work with students from historically excluded or historically marginalized groups in our country? And too often the answer in the US to everything is, well, how does Harvard do that? Harvard was not built or designed to serve students from historically marginalized or equity-seeking groups. And Harvard also has a $46 billion endowment, right? They can do things that everyone else can't. If we want to look for models of how to work well with students with disabilities, let's look at institutions that were built to serve students with disabilities, that serve large numbers of students with disabilities effectively. In the US context, that means we should look at community colleges. We should look at historically Black colleges and universities as models of equitable engagement, rather than looking at the prestige numbers or the league tables to say, where should we look? And then I hinted at this already because I interrupted myself, but really when we look at data, we need to disaggregate it. What tends to happen is data hides equity-seeking groups. So if you want to look, for example, at the perspective of students of color on my campus, where about 30% of the students on my campus are students of color, we can't just look at a survey of all of our students and say, how do students of color respond to this? Because we might see that 30% of our students are dissatisfied with a certain aspect or not having a rich experience. Well, what if we looked at that data and disaggregated it and found that 90% of our students of color are dissatisfied with something? That's only 28% of our overall student body. So it disappears in one way, and it becomes really salient if we look at the data in another way. It's on us to look at the data in ways that help us see equity and help us understand engagement. A third principle I'd like to encourage you to think about, and you've heard a lot about today, is context-aware. And we've heard a lot today about the context we're in, the broad context we're in, and that's really important. As a historian, I always get a little bit excited when someone quotes Lenin saying we're living through a time with a lot of history. That's powerful. That's really important. And I think we do need to pay attention to that broader context. I also want us, though, to focus on something we haven't talked quite as much about, from this stage at least yet, which is our own institutional context. There was a very powerful longitudinal study in the US done. It's called the Wabash National Study. You may have seen some of the evidence from it. There's a famous book in the US called Academically Adrift, which was based on Wabash National Survey data. One of the findings the Wabash study has emphasized, but just hasn't gotten a lot of uptick in the US, and this was a longitudinal study of undergraduates at more than 24 very diverse US universities. One of the biggest findings of the Wabash National Study is that the difference of student experience is greater within any single institution than it is between any two institutions. Right? So if we want to look at what excellent student experience is in Ireland, you could look at lots of different places. Perhaps the best place to look is your own institution, at the students who are thriving the most, because those are your students, and they're being successful, they're thriving. At the same time, if you want to look at where are we struggling, you don't need to look elsewhere. Look at your own students. The research in the US is really powerful in that when we talk about engagement, we shouldn't talk about engaged students and disengaged students. We should think of all students as episodically engaged. They're engaged in some aspects of their work and not others. And when we take that approach to thinking about episodic engagement, then we don't put too much faith that we're doing well or that we're doing poorly. The story's more complicated, right? A fourth principle for you is growth-oriented. And as an institution, I think what we need to do is be humble enough, be willing enough to be positively restless in our work, right? To recognize both where we're doing well, where our students are doing well, and be proud of that, but not be satisfied with that. A really excellent example of this from the US, I think, is Purdue University, which is a large research and STEM-oriented university in Indiana. And Purdue, when they compared themselves to their peers, were number one in the first-year experience in many categories about 15 years ago. They did a large study of their first-year experience. But what they decided to do that was great, but that wasn't good enough, because there were still a meaningful number of Purdue students who were struggling in the first-year experience. So the president there commissioned a 200-member body of their students, faculty, and staff to work on the first-year experience there, to say, yes, we're the best in our league, but we can be better for our students. Right? So we need that kind of positive restlessness. And then one more example is we need to recognize that involvement with quality assurance, involvement with student engagement, partnership work is powerfully educative for our students. It's an amazing opportunity for our students. I was having lunch today, actually, and we were talking about this, and one person asked, so how do we identify the students who could be engaged with our engagement work, with our quality assurance work? And there was a good conversation about that, but it struck me that the conversation was framed around how do we identify talent who'd be willing to do this? And that's important, but it leaves out how do we help those students understand that this could be one of their most powerful educational experiences? Right? This is powerful work, and so I want to hold up a model for you from Australia, a project that I know enough about to be dangerous, but I'm not involved in. It's at Western Sydney University, and it's called the 21st Century Project. And the assumption behind the premise of the 21st Century Project, you can look it up on Google, it's brilliant, they have lovely videos too. But the premise behind this is that the goal of Western Sydney is to prepare leaders, their students, to be leaders and change makers in the world. Right? And the insight of this program is, well, if you want to be a change maker in the world, what you need to be able to do is make change in organizations and in bureaucracies and in systems. And the university is nothing if not a big, complicated organization, bureaucracy, and system. Students are invested in their own education experience. They want the best for themselves and their peers, so they're willing to work hard, many of them, to affect change at the institution. Well, what if we teach the university as a space to practice the kinds of change-making skills, change-making habits, change-making knowledge that you're going to need to be a change maker in the world? I think it's just a brilliant project. And then fifth, and finally, as I close, is this work needs to be values-based. And I see that in at least two ways, again, one of which we've heard quite a lot about today, which is if our work needs to focus not on small things, but on big things. You know, if there's a climate crisis, how do we assure the quality of our education is working to address that climate crisis? And the quote there, targeting simpler outcomes, is from a large longitudinal study of change at 2 American universities. It's a really brilliant study. And one of the main findings of this is that there's a tension for those of us trying to make change in universities and in higher education more broadly, which is there's a temptation to say to people who are busy and tired, this is easy. This is small. It just takes little steps. But what this study found is that when we say that, we're also being heard as saying, this isn't very important. This maybe isn't worth your time. It's not that big of a deal. And so if we're working on something that really matters, this study suggests, we need to claim that and say, this is about this core value. This is about something that matters to all of us. My final thought, since we're thinking about centering students, is a quote from a brilliant American book on higher education by Sharon Dulles Parks. The book is called Big Questions, Worthy Dreams. And the phrase comes from students she interviewed. And this is more than 20 years ago. And it's an inspiring book, but in some ways it's a deeply depressing book. Because what Sharon was seeking in this is, why are students disengaged at university in the United States? And what she found is that students said they come to higher education with big questions and with worthy dreams. You know, they want to make a good living after they graduate. They also want to contribute to the community. They want to help their family. They want to save the planet, right? And then they come into our first-year courses, and they study intro to psychology and calculus and other important things. And what they told Sharon, and I find true at my own institution, is they very quickly learn that the first year of a university in the United States is not a place where you engage with big questions and worthy dreams. And so they become disengaged and they become transactional because we teach them to be that way. So if we really want to engage students deeply and equitably in our work, we need to honor the big questions and the worthy dreams they bring with them to our institutions, because those are deeply motivating. Those will keep them following academic integrity, and those will help us do our work to be more equitable. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Felten. I know we're going to hear from you again a little bit later on in the session. We're now going to have a panel discussion on the value of the student-staff partnerships. It's my pleasure to reintroduce Clodagh McGivern, Vice President of Academic Affairs with the Union of Students in Ireland and QQI board member. Clodagh is your panel chair today.
Hello, everyone. So I'd like to introduce our panel. So we have Róisín, who's the Director of Learner Support in SOLAS. We have Dara, Ryder, who's the CEO of AHEAD. And then we have Anna Jakobek, who is an FET learner and was also heavily involved in the ETB reviews and ETB sectoral report. So, based on Peter's fantastic presentation, I want to ask each and every one of you, what do you think we are doing well in relation to student engagement based on what we've heard today? So I'll start with Dara and come inwards then.
Yeah, I think there's lots of really good work out there on student engagement happening in Ireland. I think Ireland, it's definitely been a hot topic of conversation, right, for all of us over the last few years. I actually think that some of the best work that I've seen is actually in the classroom by educators working directly with students every day. Some of the work that we've seen on our Universal Design for Learning badge, which was delivered with UCD, with the National Forum, and delivered with a whole range of educators right across the system. I suppose the UDL framework is a framework that promotes engagement with students and tries to offer them, I suppose, a meaningful say in the direction of their programs, the design of their programs, and also gives them meaningful choices every single day in the way that they learn and how they express their learning. And for me, that's really important work for equity and inclusion generally, but it's also really important that it prepares students to be partners in the process of learning and in the wider process of how our institutions and our bodies are actually organised and delivered. So I think for me, it all starts in the classroom, and you know, everything else goes from there. And I think looking to our educators is a really kind of inspiring example of good work that can be done.
Fantastic. So we'll go to Róisín next.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, when you're thinking about this topic, learner engagement, you know, when you're asked what's going well, I suppose given with COVID, given our own experiences of how COVID has affected learners, your mind, in my mind anyway, races to disengagement. And having 3 teenagers, you're well aware of the issues even in the school system and how that has changed people's lives. But the question today is, what is going well? I suppose on behalf of the further education sector, I'd have to say from the ETB's, and many of my colleagues are here today, perspective, learner engagement is core to what they have done every single day, every single year for decades. Examples being your literacy provision, which is a one-to-one course, which engages totally with where the learner is coming from, where they want to progress to. You look at the models of community education, which clearly sets out what choice of subject you'd like to progress to. If you look at the specialist training providers provision, which offers 4,000 places, again, that's one-to-one provision based on your own pace and your own time. These are all the good news stories now. Again, your post-leaving cert provision and your apprenticeship programs. Again, you know, a lot of them programs are geared towards the needs of the industry, which again, engage the learner fully. But the question really for me and for the organisation I work for is SOLAS, is do we feel that learner engagement is going well, and what more can be done? And I know you're going to come to that question in a minute, but I suppose what is going well is that learner engagement would be a core feature of the VET system, and that's SOLAS's role really, is to ensure that there's an effective system that meets the needs of our economy. Now, if you are one of those lucky 250,000 learners that are already accessing further education, you probably will have very good learner engagement, albeit it can be improved. However, if you're one of the 1.2 to 1.9 members of our society who don't have upskilling opportunities and are in need of upskilling opportunities, perhaps your learner engagement wouldn't be as fulfilling. But to get to the key question with regard to SOLAS's perspective, I suppose is our system efficient and effective? If we're offering the right supports, the right engagement for learners with the right courses, with the right quality of teaching, with the right funding, we should have an effective system. And obviously that will be measured by impacts on well-being of your economy, the number of people that get jobs, the number of people who reach their full potential, whether that's in the home, whether that's in your community, in your life, in your job, or whatever. So I suppose there is matrix to measure that system, and I suppose if it's not effective, more needs to be done. And I'll come back later with regard to how we can further enhance learner engagement. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Anna, if you'd like to expand.
I think that when I think about what is working well, I would have to say that staff, definitely, and engagement with learners that has been brought up. I found through doing 2 statutory QA reviews for 2 different ETBs, as well as being involved with my own Cork ETB, working closely with staff with the Learner Voices group, and as well as being on the learner panel for the QA review for Cork ETB, I can confidently say that ETB has some of the most dedicated staff that you will meet probably in your entire life. Extremely dedicated, very motivated, very open to feedback. I think that there's also a huge advantage for learners in the way that they're being treated in further ed versus the mainstream secondary system. From myself, my own experience, I didn't have the best experience in the secondary system, but my experience in further ed and community ed has been positive from beginning to end. And I think that being up here today and being able to speak in front of so many people, that is a testament to that, which I would not have been able to do any of this if it wasn't for all of the amazing work that the staff have put in to provide a safe, encouraging environment that you wouldn't get in some mainstream system.
Excellent. So some excellent points raised there. So lastly, I'll finish off with this question. After reflecting on today, what do you think is something that we can improve on in relation to student engagement and partnership? And I'll start with Anna this time and then work down the way. Yeah.
I think there could be more done in terms of formalizing the learner voice and bringing it to a bit of a higher point. There is a lot of informal feedback being gathered, and there is a lot of informal work that is being done, and it's excellent informal work. But there still could be a bit more work around creating the formal learner panels, formal learner groups that encourage the learner voice. And there could be a bit more work around taking that learner feedback on board and then bringing it further into the provision, because that's extremely valuable and extremely important feedback. Because how are you supposed to know that your provision is going in the right direction and that you are doing the right thing if you're not listening to the learners?
Brilliant, thank you. So we'll go to Róisín next.
I have a whole list of areas that we would need to improve on. But if you suppose you look at it from a number of perspectives, they would say, the teleological approach to learning, the quality of teaching, the most important person in front of you is your instructor, your teacher, your practitioner, your facilitator. And I absolutely agree with that. However, I would add in an assumption in there, that's provided that that teacher is fully supported in their system, that they have an environment that supports their best practice. I suppose that they are fully involved in the system over long periods of time, that they're, I suppose, not just, available for short inputs, that they're committed over a lifetime to teaching and their profession, and the qualifications of the teacher is key, I would say, based on a lot of research, because I suppose that's where you're having most impact, and people in this room are very familiar with that. But if you look at it from a systems perspective, if you don't have the funding to match that, if the funding's not allocated to that particular task, it's extremely difficult. Having been taught many years myself, if you don't have the time, if you're tied up on assessment and you're not supported to ensure that you can engage in that calm approach of engaging your learner in the system, it's extremely difficult. So I would say number one is funding. Number two is the quality of the teacher. Number three, I suppose, if we're really serious about learner engagement or learner support or learner services, really, I suppose we have to look at the whole system. Is it the right course that suits that individual? And I suppose really, is the curriculum and the standards of the curriculum embedding learner engagement? And to be involved in learner engagement, you as a learner, will that form part of your assessment and integrate into your system? And also, is learner engagement going to be a key aspect of the European frameworks, such as, the lifelong learning frameworks, the adult education frameworks, the entrepreneurial frameworks, the Digicom frameworks, which will then be integrated into our national standards? Will that form part of that, or will it be an add-on? And myself and Dara have worked for many years looking at integrating supports for learners into the mainstream as opposed to continuously add on, and we have worked quite closely with regard to the universal design framework, and building that into the quality assurance system I think is going to be absolutely key. Also, as I said earlier, building it into the quality of the teaching practice, building it into the system of further education, that it's a core component and it's measured and it's impacted. But also just wider than that as well, that learner engagement is built into the whole of government approach to, I suppose, realising people's fulfilment and well-being. And that, it's extremely difficult to engage if, you're having difficulties in your life, under cost of living issues, outside of your learning. And I suppose that's where we have to take, as everybody here would know, a whole of person, a whole of life and a whole of society approach to learner engagement, because as we all know, people come in a whole package. You just can't cut off and say, I'll be really engaged when I'm in the classroom or when I'm undertaking an upskilling module for a day. You have your whole life. And I do think that's where the wellbeing framework for Ireland will be critical, because it'll look at our wellbeing as a society and our wellbeing as learners in a broader sense than just a narrow approach of when I'm in the classroom, when I'm doing this element of training. Yet my mind's racing because I can't afford to do X, Y, and Z. So I suppose building learner engagement into our whole approach across government. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. So last but not least, we'll go to Dara.
Thanks, Clodagh. I'm going to start in the classroom again, unsurprisingly, but I've got a few things that was jumping to mind. Peter, thanks very much for your contribution. It was really thought-provoking. But yeah, I suppose going back again, I think it's really important that we focus on pedagogy that really builds in student engagement and equity and inclusion right into the fabric of how we deliver our education systems. So things like our trauma-informed pedagogies, our pedagogies looking at decolonising the curriculum, and UDL, which we'd obviously be very big on. And we're making big progress with UDL. We have already over 2,000 have taken the UDL badge. We have 1,000 right now going through the latest iteration of it. So I think there's a really big move here in the sector to embrace that. And the reason that stuff is important, I suppose, is because it helps students to bring more of themselves into the classroom, which is, you can't actually open yourself up to be engaged if you can't get in that position of feeling in a safe space to do that. So it kind of positions students, I suppose, for their voice to be welcomed and valued, and that they can feel that and understand that. And I think it's really important from a quality assurance point of view that the system, where possible, actually rewards that practice and recognises it as practice of high quality, because it is very much evidence-informed practice and internationally recognised. So we can do that through things like our external authentication, training, for example, looking at the way we validate programmes and seeing where in that process is. The second piece, I think, is around diversifying the research community in and of itself. Our research here in AHEAD shows that students with disabilities are very, very underrepresented in postgraduate study. And I think, apart from the moral prerogative to kind of address that subject, I think there's actually a danger to the quality assurance agenda, because essentially just from the point of view that the evidence base that we're building is in and of itself at risk of bias by having a community that is very homogenous in terms of the community that's producing it. So I think that there's a risk there that we're kind of, I suppose, entrenching the systemic inequality that Peter spoke about as well. And then lastly, I suppose, will be about the more formal structures that we're building for student engagement. I think NSTEP have done absolutely fabulous work in terms of student engagement and building those formal structures. But I still actually think we have a bit of work to do in terms of making sure diverse community can engage with those formal structures, and we're actually attracting a diverse community into them. Are we kind of engaging those? who are already ready to be engaged, if that makes sense. So I suppose those from maybe particular educational backgrounds or who have the confidence and the sort of educational capital to engage in those things already, and maybe don't have a mistrust of educational power structures as it stands because of their past experience. So I think there is a risk there that we're maybe only kind of honouring the voices of students who are already in that position and already have that sort of educational capital built up. I'm not saying there's an easy answer to that, by the way, but I think we need to make more concerted efforts to directly target those students to be part of our formal student engagement structures as well.
Perfect. So a round of applause for our panel members. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Clodagh, and to all of our speakers on what was an interesting discussion. For the final part of this session, we're going to hear about the National Student Survey. This is the StudentSurvey.ie report from 2022. Professor Peter Felten is going to come back up on stage and he'll give us a brief background to the survey. So, Professor Felten again.
Hello again. I'm obviously an ineffective teacher. This panel is really brilliant. And I just want to underscore a couple things they said as a way to get into thinking about the Irish Survey of Student Engagement. This last point Dara is making, and it goes back to one of Anna's key points about really listening to students. And it's important that we informally listen to students, right? As a staff member, I should get to know the students in my classroom and all this. That's powerful. But that isn't enough. We need to be really systematic about listening to all our students, especially paying attention to whose voices we're not hearing. So as Anna said, we need to develop systems to hear from our students, not just informal practices. And then one thing Róisín said that I think is so important, my American version of this, is we really need to align our practices and our reward systems. And I think in the US, this is a huge problem, that the faculty who are in classrooms in too many institutions are rewarded for the work they do when they're not in the classroom. And that's the primary driver. And so if we really want students to experience the kinds of classrooms and the kinds of engagements that we're talking about, we need to think hard about our systems, right? Because we should not, in the US, we cannot build an effective higher education and an equitable higher education system based on the premise that faculty will work against their own professional best interest. Right? And then last but not least, and as the transition, we need evidence that helps us understand our students in really systematic ways, because it's wonderful to have one-on-one conversations with students. I love that. That's what a lot of my research is based on. But that tends not to really help us understand students systematically. And that's where something like this student survey can be a powerful tool. So as I mentioned before, I've been on the NESI board for a number of years. So I spent a lot of time in the US working with institutions and colleagues, my own institution. I'm thinking about what surveys can do for us and how to use them. Just a couple things that sometimes people don't understand about these kinds of surveys, like the student survey. First, it really focuses on what the research says are essential things for students to spend their time and energy on, right? So it's not asking students random things, or do you like this, or do you like that? It's asking, here's what we know matters most for student learning. How are you spending your time and energy, and related to that? And then the second thing these surveys tend to do is they're designed, again, drawing on deep wells of research to say, how is the institution organized? How does the curriculum provide the kinds of experiences that we know are valuable, most valuable for students? So the survey itself does that. The question really isn't about the survey, though. It's about how do we use what's in the survey. And too often in the US, we use them for rankings. I do need to say, because my president won't let me come back to North America unless I say this, that my university, Elon University, for the last 2 years has been #1 in teaching in the primary rankings of national universities. So I have to say that. So we like rankings when we're good. But more importantly, we need to use this kind of data to ask ourselves really critical questions about our own student experiences, especially about the range of student experiences, not just the average student experience. And if I may be so bold as to dig into your own report, these are on the table. And the data looks great, except for one measure from my perspective. There's a measure called Student-Faculty Interactions, 2022. And the scores there are much lower than all the other areas. And there's plenty of reasons we could explain that with COVID and everything else. But the research is really very, very clear that one of the primary drivers, in the US at least, of student persistence, student learning, student motivation, student engagement, student success, is the quality of relationships they have with academic staff. And so if that's a place where at your institution where you're getting data that isn't where you want it to be, a survey like this can highlight that and help direct your strategic efforts, because the point of this isn't the survey. The point of this is the data in the survey to catalyze strategic action, to make your institution more engaging, more equitable, and more effective for all of your students. Siobhán's going to talk a little bit more about what's in the survey. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. How's it going? So let me just make sure that I know how to work this thing. Nope. There we go. So I just wanted to give a brief rundown of some of the results of StudentSurvey.ie 2022. And as has already been highlighted, those results are available to you on your desks in front of you at the minute in the executive summary. And just as an FYI for participating institutions, that executive summary, the results section of that is available on the website at the moment as an editable infographic. So as an extra tool for you to be able to edit that with the results from your own institution and to share that with staff and with students in your institution using your institutional results. One other thing that I wanted to draw your attention to was that as for this year, the editorial group invited reflections on a couple of different things, one of them being the value of StudentSurvey.ie results for institutional and SU strategy. And we also invited reflections on the topics that we included in Chapter 4. And I'll get to what that is in a moment. But they're very interesting, and I would encourage you to take a look at those in more detail on the website. Speaking of Chapter 4, so some of you might be familiar with this, but what we always do with the report for StudentSurvey.ie is that we take a chapter where we take a closer look at a particular topic. It's called our Looking Deeper chapter. And in 2022, we broke this into two parts. And one of those parts was in relation to students' consideration of withdrawal from their degree programme. And this year, this had been a question that had been included for some students in previous years, but in 2022 was the first year that we included it as a question for all students, and we asked them, have you ever seriously considered withdrawing from your degree programme? And in this instance, 1 in 3 students of the respondents to the survey, so I will add that that is first year and final year undergraduate students and taught postgraduate students. So around about 1 in 3 of those indicated that they had seriously considered withdrawing from their programme. And if we break that down by those constituent groups, the standout group there is the final year students. So around about 45% of respondents to the survey indicated that they had considered withdrawing from their programme. And this was about 35% for first-year undergraduates, and this was about 29% for the taught postgraduate students. And the report goes into some of the further data around what we know about this, so the rate of consideration of withdrawal, but also extremely interestingly, in my mind anyways, the reasons for consideration of withdrawal, and we've been able to break those down by different student characteristics, like student gender, internationally or Irish domiciled students, but also course characteristics, so the field of study that students are in or whether they're full-time, part-time. And One of the options that students had when answering this question was they could have indicated that they considered withdrawing for personal or family reasons, for financial reasons, or for other reasons. And I was able to do a qualitative analysis of 2,702 responses to an other reason for considering withdrawal. And some of those other reasons that were highlighted included things like students regretting their choices, saying that they had wished that they had chosen a different course. Also their perception of their course, their experience so far, and indeed psychological reasons, such as, and one thing that came through quite consistently in relation to psychological reasons was self-doubt, and students feeling like they didn't belong in their course or doubting their own ability to be able to complete it. In 2019 and 2019 to 2020, the non-progression rate reported by HEA was 9%. So if you look at that in relation to the StudentSurvey.ie data, of those, so the non-progression rate relates to progression from first year undergraduate to second year undergraduate. So we see that of those who actually did leave their course, that was about 9% of students, which gives a good context to that, about 35% of first year undergraduates who consider withdrawing. But the important thing there is that in order for them to have done the survey in February and March 2022, they're still there. So it's really interesting data to give us insight into the mindset of students, the reasons that come to bear upon them that they would consider withdrawing from their course, and I suppose some of those pressures that come to bear on students. And we hope that that will be of use to institutions, to agencies and organisations represented here, and indeed to students in understanding some of those challenges and pressures for students, and hopefully doing something about those and addressing some of those challenges so that they don't continue to be dilemmas for future students. And I will say briefly then, additionally, the part 2 of our Looking Deeper chapter was a return to some of the questions that we had looked at in the report in 2021, where we had seen the most impact of COVID-19 on students' experiences, and specifically first-year undergraduate students' experiences. So we went back to those and re-examined some of those data, and very hearteningly found that for some of the areas most impacted by COVID-19, like collaborative learning, like that student-faculty interaction that has been mentioned already, those responses have bounced back to nearly pre-COVID-19 levels. And I would highly encourage you to take a look at those data, because they're presented in a beautiful interactive dashboard format that was created by our colleague Janice Lau in the HEA, and it makes for very interesting reading and for delving into further by yourselves. So finally, to note, we have taken a digital-first approach for this report for the first time. So you will, those of you who are familiar with receiving boxes of hard copies of the report, those days are over, I'm afraid. What you do have is some printed copies of the executive summary. I invite you to take those away with you, but participating institutions and again the organisations and agencies will have received a small number of printed copies for internal distribution. But all of the really rich stuff is available, as I said, in a very interactive and user-friendly layout as a microsite or as a website. And so you can find that at www.StudentSurvey.ie, and it's all available to you there. So I will just recap on that. I'll jump ahead to that, shall I? So just to mention then, so the results are available in that executive summary in front of you on the website. However, I will take the opportunity to draw your attention to this excellent well of data that we have in the form of the Trends Over Time Research 2016 to 2021. It gives great insight into a trend series of the analysis. I'm also delighted to be able to announce here today that we are running a series of research bursaries for the analysis of qualitative data from StudentSurvey.ie and PGR StudentSurvey.ie. So that's our survey of student engagement for postgraduate research students. Please do share that news with colleagues within your institutions and organisations who are involved or may be interested in doing qualitative research. And also, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we're running a series of online, short, around about lunchtime, workshops around particular aspects to do with the data analysis of StudentSurvey.ie and PGR StudentSurvey.ie, led by requests and demands from those working on the data for the areas that they're interested in and upskilling in. There is a poster outside, and if you scan the QR codes on that poster, you will get further information about those research bursaries and about all of the workshops and all of the data that I have mentioned here today. And I think in that case, I will say thank you very much to the students who completed the survey, to everybody working on StudentSurvey.ie and PGR StudentSurvey.ie, in particular, the editorial group that prepared the national report for 2022. Gormila Magiastocht Eishtocht. Thank you. And I will hand over now to Clodagh and Peter to officially launch the report.
Hello again. So this year we've seen 42,852 students answer the student survey, which is fantastic. We have to recognise last year was a difficult year for students and for the staff in the institutions as well. So the student survey continues to be an extremely useful tool for institutions and students' unions who exist in those institutions. It's weird being a student union rep because it puts you in odd situation where, you know, you're representing all of these students' views, but you can't physically talk to every single student. So it's great to have the student survey as a tool that gives us better insight into what our students are thinking, what they need. So, you know, it's great that we have it here for another year and longevity in future as well. So we do rely on this information a lot, and I think it's very important that, you know, there is student engagement and partnership when it does come to looking at the results of the surveys. Like, are we having focus groups? Are we engaging NSTEP and class reps in discussion? Are sabbatical officers at the table of these discussions whenever the surveys results are being analysed? It is great to hear directly from students though, and you know, we understand better how they're progressing academically, personally and socially. So I think what sabbatical officers would really like is to actually have, you know, full access to that data in future. It is crucial that institutions read the data and recognise their strengths as well as their weaknesses, to go about making decisions in future to actually benefit the students who answered that survey. Students and staff, as I said, must come together in relation to the feedback, and collaboration is really key in that. Like, we don't want to be working against each other, we really want to be working with each other. The Union of Students in Ireland and students' unions are eager to make use of, you know, that valuable data, and, you know, we just want the best to make improvements and enhance the facilities, supports and the learning environments that are on campus. For it to continue to be a useful instrument for capturing the student experience, it is crucial that the feedback loop is, you know, closed, and, you know, students who answer the survey and take the time out of their day are seeing the results of them actually engaging with the survey. So obviously it's great to be here. Thanks so much for hearing me speak, and as I said, collaboration is key. So long live the student survey.